Let's start by dismantling one of the most quietly damaging lies you've ever been told, the idea that memory is a gift. That some people are just born with it and others are not. That if you forget names, facts, dates, or what you studied last week, that means something is wrong with you. And because of that lie, millions of intelligent, capable people walk through life thinking they're broken. But here's the truth. You weren't born with poor memory, you were simply never taught how to use it. Think about it. No one ever handed you a manual for your mind. No one sat you down and explained how attention works, how repetition works, how meaning shapes recall. You were thrown into a classroom and expected to perform with a brain you were never trained to operate. And then, when you failed, you blamed yourself instead of the system. That's unfair, and worse than that, it's unnecessary. In Japan, memory is not treated as a mysterious talent. It's treated as a craft, just like writing, just like cooking, just like martial arts, something you practice, something you refine, something you get better at through deliberate effort. Which means that every time you've said, "I'm just bad at remembering," what you were really saying is, "I've never been shown the process." And that is a very different problem, because processes can be learned, changed, and mastered. Now here's the uncomfortable part, because once you accept memory is trainable, you also accept something far more powerful: responsibility. You no longer get to hide behind the label of not good enough. You realize you've been undertrained, not under-equipped. And that's a dangerous realization, because it means improvement is no longer a fantasy. It's a demand. You don't rise by wishing for talent. You rise by training discipline. You don't wait for a better brain. You build one, bit by bit, repetition by repetition, choice by choice. And when you finally understand that memory is not something you have, but something you build, you stop seeing your limits as walls. After you let go of the fantasy that memory is something you're either born with or cursed without, the next illusion that collapses is this one: that remembering is about being intelligent. That if you were just a little sharper, a little quicker, a little more gifted, you wouldn't struggle. But the truth is almost insulting in its simplicity. Memory does not reward brilliance, it rewards clarity. The human mind does not choke on difficulty, it chokes on chaos. When too much information comes in without structure, the brain doesn't store it, it abandons it. Not because you're incapable, but because your mind is designed to protect itself from overload. When learning feels confusing, it's not your intelligence failing, it's the design that's failing. Now here's where Japan gets it right in a way most education systems completely miss. Complexity is never attacked with more complexity. It's dissolved into simplicity. Massive ideas are broken down into their smallest useful units, one step, one pattern, one meaning at a time. And what's fascinating is this: when learning becomes simple enough, anyone can do it. Memory becomes democratic. No high IQ required. No genius label necessary. If you've ever felt stupid while studying something that later turned out to be easy once it was explained properly, you've already tasted this truth. You weren't struggling because you lacked intelligence, you were drowning in noise. What you needed wasn't more effort. It was organization. It was clean lines. It was mental space. And simplicity doesn't mean childish. It means precise. It means cutting away what doesn't matter so what does matter becomes unforgettable. When your brain finally understands something, not vaguely, not partially, but deeply and cleanly, remembering stops being work. It becomes automatic. People often say, "I just can't keep all this in my head." But here's the real confession hidden beneath that sentence. I've never been taught how to organize this in my head. Japanese learning tradition doesn't ask the brain to lift heavier weight. It teaches it how to balance the load. And once the weight is balanced, it stops crushing you. So if you've been telling yourself you're not smart enough, stop. The problem was never your brain. Once information becomes simple and organized, something surprising happens. It stops being exhausting. And that's where most people make their next mistake. They assume that if learning feels easier, it must be weaker. So they abandon it. They wait for pressure, for deadlines, for panic to force them into action, and then they cram. Hours and hours in one sitting, trying to shove a week's worth of meaning into a single anxious night. But here's the brutal truth. Your brain does not learn under attack. It records under rhythm. In Japan, repetition is not treated like punishment. It isn't some dull, mechanical chore meant to break you down. It's treated like sharpening a blade. A little at a time, every day, precise, almost invisible in the moment, and yet over time unstoppable. Cramming creates familiarity, repetition creates ownership. When you reread something 5 times in one night, your brain thinks it understands. But it doesn't store it, it recognizes it. That's not memory, that's illusion. Real memory is built when the brain is forced to retrieve information after space has passed. When you return to something a day later, then a few days later, then again the next week, something powerful happens. The brain stops visiting, it starts building, and the intervals matter more than the hours. 10 minutes today does more than 2 hours once a week, not because it feels productive, but because it physically rewires your brain. Those tiny, intentional returns send a signal that says, "This matters." And whatever the brain believes matters, it protects. That's why children who practice a little every day surpass adults who practice once a month with heroic intensity. Because consistency always outpaces drama. The Japanese approach doesn't push longer study, it designs smarter return. It turns learning into a relationship instead of a rescue mission. You don't run to the material when you're desperate. You visit it before you forget, and over time forgetting itself becomes a stranger. Most people beg for motivation. But memory doesn't listen to emotion, it listens to exposure. Your brain doesn't care how inspired you feel, it cares how often you return. When repetition is done correctly, something else starts to change, not just how often you remember, but how you remember. Up until now, most of your learning has probably relied on words, paragraphs, notes, lists. Endless lines of text you hope your brain will somehow preserve. But the mind was never designed to remember like a filing cabinet. It doesn't store in pages, it stores in pictures. Think about your childhood. You may not remember the math you learned at 8 years old, but you probably remember your classroom, the color of the walls, the face of one teacher, the smell of the books. Memory clings to scenes, not sentences. Your brain is a theater, not a typewriter. It remembers what it sees, not what it's told. Japanese learning methods lean heavily into this truth. They turn abstract information into shape, into movement, into image. A concept is no longer just an idea. It becomes a symbol. A word becomes a picture. A process becomes a scene, And once something becomes visual, it stops being forgettable. You struggle to remember a name, but you don't struggle to remember a face. You forget a definition. But you remember a moment that embarrassed you 10 years ago perfectly. That's not random, that's design. Emotion and imagery carve memory deeper than logic ever could. And here's the key: visualization is not decoration. It's structure. When you link information to an image, you give your brain a hook. When you turn a lesson into a scene, you give it a location. Memory thrives on place. That's why stories beat statistics, and imagination outperforms instruction. If you want proof, think of your favorite movie scene. Now think of a page from your old textbook. One lives in your mind like a photograph. The other faded within a week, not because you didn't try hard enough, but because one spoke your brain's native language. Most people try to force memory through effort. The Japanese approach invites memory through design. So don't make your mind work harder. Once you begin to use images, scenes, and symbols, something subtle but powerful takes place. Learning no longer feels like an event you attend. It begins to feel like a place you live. And that's where routine enters the picture, not as a boring schedule, but as a kind of psychological architecture. Because what you repeat in your environment quietly becomes who you are. Most people wait to feel ready before they act. They wait for motivation, for energy, for the right mood. But memory doesn't grow in moments of excitement. It grows in moments of normal. It grows when effort becomes automatic, when the mind stops asking, "Should I?" and starts saying, "This is just what I do." In Japanese culture, routine is not a cage. It's a freedom system. It removes decision fatigue. It eliminates negotiation with yourself. When learning becomes part of your day in the same way brushing your teeth does, it no longer depends on discipline, it depends on identity. You don't wake up and debate whether to wash your face. You simply do it. And that's exactly where learning must live if you want your memory to mature, not in your ambition, but in your lifestyle. When repetition is tied to time and place, the brain begins to anticipate. It expects learning the way it expects sunrise. And anticipation is a powerful thing. It primes attention. It opens the door before information even knocks. This is why people who study when they feel like it rarely remember anything, and people who study at the same time, same place, in the same way quietly transform. Your environment trains you when you're not paying attention. A desk tells your mind to focus. A notebook tells your brain to prepare. A ritual tells your nervous system it's safe to concentrate. Routine gives you stability. Visual thinking gives you clarity. Repetition gives you endurance, but none of that matters if you secretly despise small progress. If you've been trained to worship sudden breakthroughs and overnight success, you'll overlook the only kind of growth that actually rewires a human being, the boring kind. The quiet kind. The kind no one applauds. In Japanese thinking, mastery is not something that arrives in a dramatic moment. It emerges like sunrise, slowly, predictably, inevitably. A craftsman does not chase perfection. He visits his work every day. He improves the cut by a fraction. He refines the motion by a millimeter. And over time, that microscopic care builds something almost supernatural. Most people quit not because the work is too hard, but because the reward is too delayed. They want inspiration. They want intensity. They want results with cinematic timing, but real growth moves in inches, not explosions. The mind evolves the same way the body does, not through heroic days, but through faithful ones. You don't wake up one morning with a powerful memory. You earn it invisibly. And here's the beautiful irony: the people who commit to small improvement become unstoppable, not because they're intense, but because they're patient. They understand that 10 minutes a day is not insignificant. It's prophetic. When you choose improvement, even when it feels meaningless, you are casting a vote for the person you are becoming. Not tomorrow, not next year, today.